The town of Silver Creek sits on the edge of Alaska's vast wilderness, where life unfolds at a slower pace. The streets are quiet, the houses modest but well-kept, and neighbors know each other by name. It's the kind of place where doors are left unlocked, and secrets rarely stay hidden for long. At the heart of this small town lived the Rogers family, a picture-perfect family of three. David Rogers, a decorated police officer with 20 years on the force, was well respected in the community. He was a man people trusted, a dedicated officer who spent countless hours serving the very streets he called home. In his uniform, he carried himself with an air of authority that earned him the admiration of his peers. His wife, Laura, was the glue that held their family together. She was a homemaker, known for her warm smile and devotion to her family. Laura spent her days caring for their daughter, Madison, a 15-year-old with special needs. Madison, described by neighbors as bright and kind, required full-time care due to her developmental delays. From the outside, the Rogers family seemed to embody stability and love. David's demanding job as a police officer was balanced by the sanctuary of home life. Their modest house, painted a cheerful shade of yellow, was always filled with the sound of laughter, proof, it seemed, of their close bond as a family. But it was the details of their everyday life that truly defined them in the eyes of their neighbors. Every Sunday, they attended the local church, sitting in the same pew near the stained glass windows. Laura baked pies for community fundraisers, and David coached the local Little League team when his schedule allowed. Madison was often seen riding her bicycle in the cul-de-sac, waving to passers-by. The Rogers were more than just a family. They were a cornerstone of Silver Creek. Their presence seemed to reassure others that everything was as it should be. For years, their neighbors described them in one word: dependable. It's these moments, these small, seemingly insignificant acts of care and connection, that made the Rogers family stand out. They weren't just respected, they were cherished. But life in a quiet town doesn't always follow the rules. And sometimes, the trust we place in those closest to us can leave us blindsided by what we don't see. Before we continue, did you know that over 80% of our viewers haven't subscribed to this channel? If you're enjoying this content and want to see more gripping true crime stories, please support us by hitting the subscribe button and turning on notifications. It helps us bring you more stories like this. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for your support. It started innocently enough, at least, that's what Laura Rogers told herself. The small, unusual moments that caught her attention were easy to dismiss. David had been working late more often. When he came home, his uniform shirt, which he used to leave neatly hung by the bedroom door, was now tossed into the laundry hamper without a word. Madison seemed quieter, distracted even, when Laura asked about her day. At first, Laura chalked it up to the stress of David's job. After all, being a police officer wasn't easy. She'd heard him talk about the long hours, the emotional toll, the things he'd seen. And Madison, she was growing up. Teenagers were known to drift into their own worlds, weren't they? But there was something Laura couldn't shake, a nagging feeling that woke her up in the middle of the night. A fleeting thought she tried to bury but couldn't. And then, one evening, it happened. Laura had gone to bed early, exhausted from a day spent organizing a fundraiser at Madison's school. David had stayed up, sitting at the kitchen table, paperwork spread out in front of him. Or so Laura thought. It wasn't until she got up for a glass of water that she realized his chair was empty, the back door slightly ajar. It was cold outside, so cold that her breath hung in the air as she stepped onto the back porch. She called out his name, softly at first, then louder when there was no response. But it wasn't David's voice she heard in return. It was Madison's. The sound came from the garage. A muffled laugh, followed by David's low voice, saying something Laura couldn't quite make out. She froze, the glass of water trembling in her hand. Why was Madison in the garage this late? And why was David there with her? She stepped closer, her bare feet crunching softly against the frost-covered grass. The garage door was cracked open just enough for her to see inside. What she saw stopped her in her tracks. Madison stood near the workbench, her head tilted to the side as she listened to David. He was holding something in his hands. Laura couldn't see what, and leaning in closer to their daughter than seemed necessary. The way Madison looked at him, the way his hand brushed against her shoulder, it was a gesture Laura couldn't explain, but it filled her with an unease so profound she felt rooted to the spot. David glanced toward the garage door, and Laura ducked back before he could see her. Her heart raced as she hurried inside, locking the door behind her. She wanted to confront him right then, demand an explanation, but fear held her back. Fear of what he might say. Fear of what she might already know but couldn't bring herself to admit. For days, Laura tried to convince herself it was nothing. She told herself she was overthinking, that it had been an innocent moment she'd misinterpreted. But the distance between her and David only grew. He avoided eye contact, left the room whenever she walked in, and spoke to her only when absolutely necessary. Madison, too, seemed different. She stopped riding her bike in the cul-de-sac and spent most of her time in her room. When Laura asked her if something was wrong, Madison would shrug and mumble a vague response, her eyes fixed on the floor. Then came the phone call. It was late afternoon when Laura picked up the landline in the kitchen. On the other end was a woman she didn't recognize. A colleague of David's, she said. Her tone was hesitant, as if she wasn't sure whether to continue. But when she did, the words tumbled out quickly, each one sharper than the last. "You need to know what's going on," the woman said. "I don't know how else to say this, but I think there's something inappropriate happening between David and Madison." The phone slipped from Laura's hand, clattering against the countertop. Her pulse thundered in her ears as the woman's words replayed in her mind. Inappropriate. What did she mean by that? What had David done? Laura didn't wait for David to come home that night. She drove straight to the police station, demanding answers. She wanted to believe the worst wasn't true. She wanted to hear that the woman was mistaken, that there was an explanation for everything. But as she sat in the station's waiting room, staring at the photos of officers on the wall, David's photo among them, her hope began to crumble. When David finally arrived, he looked at her with a mix of confusion and irritation. But Laura didn't hesitate. She confronted him in the middle of the station lobby, her voice rising with each accusation. David denied everything. He told her she was being ridiculous, paranoid, that the woman who had called her was out to ruin his reputation. He said Madison was his daughter, for God's sake, and he loved her more than anything in the world. But the way he said it, his tone, his body language, didn't sit right with Laura. She knew David better than anyone, and what she saw in him that night wasn't the man she had married. It was the beginning of a truth she would soon wish she had never uncovered. The days that followed were a blur for Laura. Sleep was a distant memory, replaced by restless hours of pacing the living room and staring out the window at the driveway, waiting for David to come home. When he did, their conversations were clipped, their words laced with unspoken accusations. Madison stayed in her room, emerging only for meals, her gaze darting between her parents before retreating once again into silence. Laura felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of her suspicions. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong, but without proof, she didn't know how to confront it. The phone call from David's colleague had been the spark, but now her mind was filled with flashes of past moments she hadn't questioned at the time. The way David would linger too long when hugging Madison, the quiet conversations between them that stopped whenever she entered the room, the times he insisted on taking her out for father-daughter bonding without Laura. And then she found the journal. Laura had been cleaning Madison's room, a routine she'd done countless times before, when she noticed a small, leather-bound notebook tucked beneath the mattress. She hesitated for only a moment before opening it, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. The entries were fragmented, written in Madison's shaky handwriting. At first, they seemed innocent. Musings about school, her favorite books, and the occasional complaint about being grounded. But as Laura read further, her heart sank. Madison had written about feelings she didn't understand, about secret time with her father, and how he told her not to tell anyone because it was their special thing. Laura dropped the journal as if it had burned her fingers. She sat on the edge of the bed, tears streaming down her face, the weight of the words sinking into her chest like stones. This was the proof she had been dreading. She confronted Madison that evening, her voice shaking as she asked her daughter to explain the entries. Madison looked terrified, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She hesitated, then whispered, "He said you'd be mad at me if I told you." Laura pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her tightly as sobs racked both of their bodies. She promised Madison that she wasn't mad, that none of this was her fault, and that she would make sure it never happened again. That night, Laura made a decision. She wouldn't go to the police, not yet. She didn't trust them to handle this properly, especially since David was one of their own. Instead, she would confront him directly. She needed to hear the truth from his own mouth, no matter how much it hurt. When David came home late that night, Laura was waiting for him in the kitchen. The journal lay open on the table, the pages illuminated by the harsh light of the overhead lamp. He stopped in his tracks when he saw her, his eyes darting from her face to the journal. "What is this?" she asked, her voice low but firm. David didn't answer. His face hardened, and he took a step toward the table, but Laura slammed her hand down on the journal before he could reach it. "I need you to tell me the truth," she said, her voice breaking. "What have you been doing with our daughter?" For a moment, David said nothing. Then he laughed, a short, bitter sound that sent a chill down Laura's spine. "You've lost your mind," he said. "You're trying to ruin me." Laura stood her ground. She pointed to the journal, to the words written in their daughter's hand, and demanded an explanation. David's expression shifted, his anger replaced by something darker. He stepped closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "And if you keep pushing, you're going to regret it." Laura's heart pounded as she realized the man standing in front of her was a stranger. The man she had trusted, loved, and built a life with was gone, replaced by someone she no longer recognized. David stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Laura stayed in the kitchen, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as she struggled to breathe. She knew then that her family would never be the same. The next day, David didn't come home. Laura tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. She called the station, but they told her he wasn't on duty. Panic set in as she realized she had no idea where he was or what he might do. That night, Madison came to her room, tears streaming down her face. "Mom," she whispered, "he was here." Laura's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He came into my room," Madison said, her voice barely audible. "He said I should come with him. He said you didn't love me anymore." Laura's fear turned to rage. She told Madison to stay in her room, locking the door behind her before grabbing the phone and dialing 911. She told the operator everything: the journal, the confrontation, Madison's account of what had just happened. She begged them to send someone, anyone, to protect her and her daughter. But when the police arrived, David was gone. That night, Laura sat by Madison's bedside, clutching her daughter's hand as she tried to keep the fear at bay. She had no idea where David was, but she knew one thing for certain: he would be back. The morning after that harrowing night, Laura walked into the local police station, gripping Madison's journal tightly in her hands. She felt every step like a weight pressing her deeper into the ground. This wasn't just about David anymore. It was about protecting her daughter, no matter the cost. The officers she spoke to knew David. They had worked with him for years. Some were hesitant, unsure how to proceed. But Laura's desperation was undeniable, and the evidence she presented, the journal, her account of Madison's statements, and her description of David's behavior, left little room for doubt. A formal investigation was launched. For the first time, David's name wasn't spoken with respect or admiration. It was uttered in hushed tones, laden with suspicion. Laura agreed to let detectives interview Madison, a process that proved to be both heartbreaking and revealing. Madison, in her soft, halting words, recounted moments that confirmed Laura's worst fears. The investigators also uncovered disturbing patterns in David's behavior. Colleagues recalled him frequently leaving early from shifts under vague excuses. A deeper dive into his digital footprint revealed alarming searches and encrypted files that hinted at a man leading a double life. But David wasn't around to answer for any of it. By now, David had gone into hiding. Weeks turned into months, and every lead seemed to end in frustration. Laura and Madison lived under constant police surveillance, knowing that his absence didn't mean they were safe. Laura fortified the house, double-checking every lock and sleeping with a phone by her side. She lived in fear of hearing his voice, of seeing him in the shadows. And then, just as it seemed the trail had gone cold, a tip came in. A hunter in the remote Alaskan wilderness had stumbled upon a makeshift campsite deep in the woods. Among the discarded cans and blankets, the hunter had found a wallet. Inside was David's badge. Within hours, a team of officers descended on the area, combing through the thick forest. They found David holed up in a small cabin, looking gaunt and disheveled, but armed and ready to defend himself. The standoff lasted hours. Negotiators pleaded with him to surrender peacefully, but David refused. Eventually, he was apprehended without injury, and for the first time in months, Laura and Madison felt the weight of his presence lifted. David's arrest set the stage for one of the most shocking trials in Silver Creek's history. The courtroom was packed as the community, once so proud of its decorated officer, now watched as he faced charges that included child abuse, endangering the welfare of a minor, and aggravated assault. The prosecution laid out their case with precision. They presented Madison's journal, which had been submitted as key evidence. They played recordings of Madison's testimony, taken during her interviews with trained specialists. Though Madison was not required to testify in open court, her words echoed through the room, breaking the silence with their raw honesty. The defense, meanwhile, sought to undermine the narrative. They painted Laura as an unstable, vindictive woman who had fabricated the allegations to ruin her husband's career. They argued that the journal entries were the product of a child's overactive imagination and that the evidence against David was circumstantial at best. But the prosecution's case was bolstered by expert testimony. A forensic psychologist detailed the patterns of grooming and manipulation evident in David's interactions with Madison. A digital forensics expert testified about the incriminating files recovered from David's devices, files that the defense could not explain away. The most emotional moments came from Laura herself. She took the stand, her voice steady but filled with emotion as she recounted the night she found the journal, the confrontation in the kitchen, and the terror of realizing David had come back for Madison. Her testimony left the courtroom silent, her words a stark reminder of the human toll of the case. David remained expressionless throughout the trial, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. He did not testify, and his refusal to address the accusations only added to the weight of the evidence against him. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. David Rogers was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Laura and Madison, it was a moment of justice, but not one of celebration. The scars left by David's actions would take far longer to heal than any court ruling could provide. As he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, David turned to Laura for the briefest of moments. Whatever he meant to convey, she didn't care. She turned away, holding Madison's hand tightly as they walked out of the courthouse together. The crisp air outside was a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside the courtroom, but neither of them felt any lighter. Justice had been served, but the wounds left behind by David's betrayal were far from healed. In the weeks that followed the trial, Laura found herself grappling with the silence. For so long, her life had been consumed by fear, anger, and the drive to protect her daughter. Now that it was over, she wasn't sure how to move forward. Madison, too, struggled to adjust. She no longer had to look over her shoulder or live with the shadow of her father's presence, but the emotional toll of his actions lingered. Her once vibrant smile was rare, replaced by a quietness that Laura didn't know how to reach. Therapy became a lifeline for both of them. Laura began attending weekly sessions, unpacking the years she had spent ignoring the cracks in her marriage. She spoke about the guilt that haunted her, the guilt of not seeing the signs sooner, of not protecting Madison from the start. Her therapist reminded her that blame lay solely with David, but letting go of that guilt was easier said than done. Madison's journey was even more delicate. Her sessions focused on rebuilding trust, processing her emotions, and finding a way to reclaim her sense of self. Slowly, with the help of compassionate professionals, she began to open up about the trauma she had endured. As months turned into a year, Laura made the decision to leave Silver Creek. The small town that had once been a place of comfort now felt like a constant reminder of the life she and Madison had lost. She sold the house and moved to a neighboring city, hoping for a fresh start. But starting over wasn't easy. Everywhere they went, Laura felt the weight of her past following her. At the grocery store, she caught herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see David. At night, she double-checked the locks, a habit she couldn't seem to break. For Madison, the transition was equally challenging. She struggled to make friends at her new school, wary of letting anyone too close. Laura watched as her daughter retreated further into herself, and it broke her heart. But one day, something shifted. It was a simple moment. Madison came home from school holding a small clay figure she had made in art class. She handed it to Laura, her shy smile returning for the first time in months. It was a turning point, a reminder that healing was possible, even if it came in small, incremental steps. Laura began volunteering at a local shelter for survivors of abuse. It was her way of channeling her pain into something meaningful, of finding purpose in the aftermath of tragedy. Through her work, she met women who had faced similar horrors and found solace in their shared experiences. Madison discovered her own form of healing through art. She began painting, using bright colors and bold strokes to express emotions she couldn't put into words. Laura filled their new home with Madison's artwork, each piece a testament to her resilience and strength. As time passed, Laura and Madison found moments of joy again. They took road trips, explored new hobbies, and allowed themselves to dream about a future untainted by the past. Laura often thought about how far they had come, from the darkest days of their lives to a place where hope felt within reach. But there were still reminders of what they had endured. Every year, the anniversary of David's arrest brought back a flood of emotions. Laura and Madison would light a candle together, not to honor him, but to acknowledge their survival and the strength they had found in each other. Laura also stayed in touch with the detectives and lawyers who had worked on their case. She wanted to ensure that what happened to her family would never happen to anyone else. She became an advocate for stronger laws to protect children and survivors of abuse, speaking at events and sharing her story with those willing to listen. For Madison, the scars ran deep, but so did her determination to overcome them. As she grew older, she began to speak out in her own way, through her art, through essays she wrote in school, and eventually through conversations with others who had faced similar experiences. Their story became one of resilience, of a mother and daughter who refused to let the darkness of their past define their future. They had been broken, but they were not defeated. And while the memories of David's betrayal would always be a part of their lives, Laura and Madison chose to focus on the present, on the small victories, the moments of laughter, and the unshakable bond they had built together. In the end, they were survivors, not victims. And that, Laura knew, was the greatest justice of all.